Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, Pakistan has released a dossier regarding Indian malign activities, according to the dossier at least, vis-a-vis a whole range of activities that we can possibly discuss. Its support of who's who of terror groups, its support for, its violations of Pakistani sovereignty, in fact, I should say, against Security Council resolutions around the world, its efforts to hurt the CPEC project as well as killing of civilians, etc., across the LOC, i.e. the line of control. I mean, this dossier is quite detailed, of course. I don't want to get into every single detail of it, but there are international law angles here which are extremely important to highlight and discuss. And to discuss that then further, we're now joined by Sikandar Ahmed Shah, who is a professor of international law at Lum's University. He's also a former legal advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's joining us from right here in Lahore. Sikandar, thanks for your time today. Let's start off, Sikandar, if we can, about what the dossier itself entails and what it has within it. For you, I mean, what has stood out vis-a-vis the Indian activities and, of course, the international law angle on that?
No, I think it's a welcome development that the state of Pakistan is legally laying out Indian terrorist or terrorist-sponsored activities in Pakistan, because in international law you have to state your positions, and India has been doing this with impunity in terms of at least vocalizing its interference in Pakistan of a terrorist nature. Their defense minister, the national security advisor, the former national security advisor, has openly sort of indicated this. So it's important for Pakistan to outline and also lay out its legal positions, because then you have to link all of that to what is the international law out there, and then subsequently, after outlining that, take it to the necessary forum at both the UN and various sort of, as you were pointing out, Waqar, there are numerous Security Council resolutions. There's a working group which is under 1566. It's a working group which allows the UN to basically determine terrorist activity and then subsequently sanction and act on that. And so this organization, the organizations active in Pakistan, like BLA, is not just a terrorist organization as outlined by Pakistan. It's been held to be a terrorist organization by UN and the EU and the US. And so for us to come out with these positions, it's very important, because you can see there's an attempt by India to conflate terrorism with self-determination, and what they see as an attempt, what they are trying to do is basically trying to conflate these two doctrines vis-a-vis Kashmir. And so CPEC is part of that sort of Kashmir initiative, it being in Kashmir and then subsequently coming into Balochistan. So they want to link it all to Kashmir, but okay, you can't do that. It's a battle of narratives, and they're colloquially different areas, and also different legal, the legal status is different. One is an internal matter, the other is a matter that is a matter of international law. So coming back to your point, I think what we've done is a good job in outlining Indian involvement, and then sort of linking that to the sponsorship of terrorism, and then looking at prescriptions that might be available for us in raising this at the UN and other international forums.
I mean, I'm looking right now, at least according to this dossier, around Pakistani rupees, that is 22 billion, which is, a very significant amount of money, of course. I mean, I imagine there are issues of terrorist financing even within this, aren't there?
Right. Yeah, definitely. So there is this, and this is a very good point, because I think what India has successfully managed to do is, because of their political cloud, is that in the context of FATF, they have managed, which primarily deals with terrorist financing, they've managed to blacklist Pakistan. And I think one option available for Pakistan is to outline this and do it systematically, so that we can basically raise this at both FATF would be the right forum, but also there is, after September 11th, there is a comprehensive framework out there that the UN has set up through Security Council Resolution 1373, which established the Counterterrorism Committee and eventually the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and then supplemented by General Assembly resolutions. So a lot of that deals with terrorist financing. Most of it is actually about terrorist financing and domestic municipal measures taken to basically implement that mandate to prevent financing from happening. But this is clearly that India is not just doing this internally, but externally by two of our neighbors, perpetuating terrorism in Pakistan. So I think Pakistan must raise both the relevant Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, and also the relevant treaties dealing with terrorist financing, and then also the FATF.
Okay, then as a final comment before I let you go, then Sikandar, about CPEC then, what are your thoughts about that? Because, I mean, the dossier does give quite a few details about how India has tried to subvert that entire project also.
Exactly, and I think it again it ties to the ability of Pakistan to bring out certain areas out of poverty, and so initially what would be social disparity and economic disparity. And this is something I think what Pakistan is doing is a good thing, because it's completely legal, because even though our arrangements with China are subject to the final resolution of the Kashmir dispute. So any socioeconomic development in an area that is subject to a UN referendum in no way undermines that eventual outcome, and that is what is stated in the peace treaty we signed with China, and that is something we have an understanding with India on the Indus Water Treaty. So I think, legally speaking, India, by interfering in this matter, even if you assume this is subject to a final resolution, is a violation of not just Pakistan's sovereignty, but international, or generally speaking, where they're trying to prevent a local community from developing and violating their human rights, undermining the human rights of the right to develop, which is established right now under international law.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, Sikandar, but we sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expert insight with us. I was Sikandar Ahmed Shah, speaking to us from right here in Lahore, speaking about this dossier that Pakistan has released to the international community, and most importantly, of course, the United Nations, outlining what it says is malign activities of India towards, of course, Pakistan specifically, be it CPEC, be it support for terrorist groups, I should say more specifically, and otherwise, even the killing of civilians, LOC violations, et cetera, et cetera. The list is quite long. As Sikandar said, it's good to have this laid out, evidence-based, right, to make your case to the international community, because it's not like the international community does not have laws in place to deal with these sorts of things. And now, of course, we'll have to wait and see whether and how the international community does react and what it does next now that it has the evidence in its hands. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the coronavirus vaccines, which, of course, as we know, the UK, of course, has already approved one vaccine for use there, and even has started administering it to certain people within society, the elderly generation, etc. But then there is now an issue, according to Oxfam and Amnesty International, as well as other such human rights groups, that rich nations are essentially hoarding a lot of the vaccines, where some nations, such as Canada, have 5 times, or have ordered at least 5 times the number of vaccines that they actually need for their own population. I believe the U.S. figure is something like 3 times what the U.S. needs for its own figure. And of course, this is what they've ordered according to the different pharmaceutical companies who have come out with their respective vaccines. And of course, all of that will be delivered in due time whenever those are approved, seemingly by the respective nations. Now, all of this, of course, goes very much against what a lot of the promises were made, especially at the United Nations and otherwise, about having equal distribution of the vaccine, because, whether we like it or not, the fact is that the pandemic has proven that we are all in a very interconnected world. So if the pandemic, God forbid, were to remain in one part of the world, that would then always keep another part of the world, even a rich nation, in danger, because if somebody were to travel from there or otherwise, then that very well could bring that pandemic back with them. So this needs to be done on an equal basis so that we rid this virus entirely from the face of the earth, or to the extent that we, of course, can. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Daniel J. Daly, who is an associate professor of moral theology at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He's joining us this morning from Boston, Massachusetts. Daniel, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us. There's a lot to discuss here, right? But I mean, it's just the idea that you would hoard to that extent, which sort of defies logic, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and it defies good ethics. If we, as you rightly note, if we believe that we are interconnected, and it's clear that we are. So the researchers that are doing the research on these vaccines, The food they eat is grown across the world. The clothes they wear are sewn across the world. We can't separate ourselves from the global economy, from global relationships. And I don't think we should. And I think in a moment in which we're in a global public crisis, we're all suffering from this. We've got to take a coordinated public global approach, not a go at your own approach where rich nations can opt out of the system at the expense of the middle income and poorer nations. And so I think it's fundamentally, as you rightly note, we're interconnected. We see that through the virus. The solution should be an interconnected, coordinated solution in my mind.
But, then the other side, Dan, obviously say that, listen, pharmaceutical companies have spent such huge sums of money getting to this vaccine, to their respective vaccines, that is, who then covers those costs?
That's a great point. So some of these vaccines have been funded by taxpayer money. And so, my approach to this is that each nation certainly has its primary responsibility is its own citizens. So the people living within its borders. And so while I would first say that each nation should take care of its most vulnerable people first. And I think we should do this in a coordinated way, though. I don't think this, again, should be a go-it-alone way. But after that, after we take care of the people with comorbidities and the elderly, healthcare workers, after we get them vaccinated, the vaccine should be made available throughout the world. So if the United States takes care of that percentage of people, and let's call that somewhere in the realm of 10% of the US population, after that, we should make sure that every other part of the world has their vulnerable persons vaccinated. And only then do we make sure that the rest of us who are relatively invulnerable to the worst parts of this disease. So a healthy adult and a healthy child who contract COVID probably will not be symptomatic, probably will not be hospitalized. But there will be people throughout the world who will be if they have lung issues or diabetes or they're older. Yeah. So I think that's the approach we should take, getting all of the vulnerable people treated and vaccinated before we move on to those of us who are relatively invulnerable to the ravages of the disease.
Indeed.
But I will say that in one state, in Massachusetts, here in the United States, yesterday they rolled out their timeline. And for someone like me, a healthy adult, I'm expected to get the vaccine sometime in April or May, where people throughout the world who have comorbidities won't be getting it until 2021, late 2021 or 2022. I think that's fundamentally.
Because this also creates, in some ways, Danny, doesn't it, like this, I mean, we're already living in a very unequal world, certainly, so it's not like that's a surprise, but this just exacerbates those inequalities, right? Because then if we have parts of the world where the pandemic has not been resolved and the people have not been vaccinated, or at least those who are at high risk have not been vaccinated, then we have issues, basic issues, right? Then those people cannot travel, for example, abroad to other countries for studies, for example. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud on future scenarios which could become very problematic. This sort of cuts people off then from each other in some ways, and better opportunities too.
Absolutely. So here at Boston College, we have many international students, and those students I've been teaching through Zoom, which it's great that we have Zoom, that we can teach students through that modality. But certainly those students coming from all over the world are missing out on the best parts of our education. And until they get vaccinated, they will not be allowed in the United States for their education. The same thing goes for business travel and business people. To your point, we are exacerbating injustices that already exist when we should be doing the exact opposite. And in fact, this is what Pope Francis has called for, that we should begin by the most vulnerable, the poorest, should be first in line for the vaccine, not the wealthiest, not the richest. The preferential option for the poor. Our decision is first and foremost for the most vulnerable. But we've decided against that. Our preferential option, our first choice is for the most powerful, for the most wealthy. And that cuts against Christian ethics, Muslim ethics, I think good international ethics. And I think there are good reasons that we shouldn't be taking the approach that we're taking right now.
So, I mean, do you think that, obviously the United Nations has condemned this already and has said this is worrying and, we shouldn't be having what I believe is called vaccine nationalism, I think is the word that the Secretary General used, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think that at the end of the day, the world will do the right thing? Because again, as I put to you earlier, and as you already alluded to, we are connected. So whether we like it or not, this is going to affect all of us if the virus is still even in one part of the world. I mean, we can't cut off a whole part of the world, can we?
Well, the question is, will we rise to the occasion? There have been times in our history as we've kind of come together in a globalized way that we have. I can think of the Marshall Plan in the aftermath of the Second World War. Even Jonas Salk, who found was the spearhead of the polio vaccine, discovered the polio vaccine. He refused to patent it. So he wasn't making money off of it, so that it was widely available throughout the nation in the United States, but also throughout the world. Right now, the solution that many are touting is basically a charity solution. It's not a justice-based solution, but it is the COVAX solution that Bill Gates has been pushing, and that is that wealthy donors will pony up some money so that middle-income and lower-income nations can buy the vaccine. But all that does is put the middle-income and lower-income nations in competition with higher-income nations.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a charity approach. It's a charity solution. So that is to say, those middle and lower-income nations are at the goodwill of the people who choose to give the money. And right now, that has not been funded. It's woefully underfunded. We need not a charity solution, but a justice solution.
Exactly.
That is a solution by which we have international agreements about how to justly distribute vaccine.
Yeah. All right, Daniel, we'll have to final word, but we sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning. That was Daniel Daly speaking to us there from Boston, Massachusetts, sharing his thoughts there about this is worrying, statistic. Canada buying 5 times more than what it needs for its population. The U.S. buying 3 times more, I believe it is. I mean, what exactly are they hoping to achieve by hoarding these vaccines? I mean, of course, there's an argument to be made about, of course, as Daniel also said, ensuring that your own citizens are covered, and no one's going to argue that. Your first responsibility is towards your own nation and citizens, but then what of the rest of the world? I mean, if you have 5 times the amount you need, for example, what are you going to do with the other leftovers? Because it's not like a lot of these vaccines are easy to store. Some of them have to be stored in very, very tough conditions, in fact, in very cold temperatures. I believe it's the Moderna one that has to be kept in very cold conditions. What of the rest of the world? How will this be distributed? As Daniel did laid out, of course, Bill Gates also has this plan in place. Will that work? Will the United Nations finally get the support it needs from the richer nations to ensure that the vaccine, whenever they're out, all of them, and there are a number of vaccines in the works, that they'll be distributed on a fair basis to even nations that can't afford to pay for them? Again, this is an interconnected world, so it defies logic to only have vaccines distributed to some people and not others, especially considering we know this is a contagious virus altogether. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Afghan civilian casualties. Now, according to the Costs of War Project at Brown University in the United States, in 2019, U.S. and coalition-era attacks have soared, civilian casualties by 330% in 2019. More civilians have died in that past year, than any other year since the beginning of the war in 2001, when the U.S. got involved right after 9/11. Now, this also then points out, this report also goes on to point out that once the talks began with the Taliban, the U.S. did to be fair to it, did bring down its airstrike numbers significantly, but then the Afghan forces then picked up, and then now, according to the report, many civilians have died at the hands of the Afghan forces as well in airstrikes and other such means that they have carried out attacks as well. Let's discuss all of this a bit further, and of course the kind of impact it has, A, on the peace process, and B, of course, on just the fact that we have this, what will be termed, quote-unquote, collateral damage of innocence. We're joined now by Dr. Jonathan Matusitz, who is an associate professor of terrorism studies at the University of Central Florida, who is joining us this morning from Orlando, Florida. Joining us from Kabul, Afghanistan, is Hamdullah Hamdard, who is a representative of the Adalat Party and an Afghanistan political expert. Hamdullah and Jonathan, thank you both for your time today. Hamdullah, let me start with you. Let's firstly start with the U.S. Coalition itself, and then we can, of course, talk about the Afghan forces also. But do you think that it should be of concern that civilian casualties went up by 330%? I mean, that seems like a staggeringly high number.
As the report says, that it shows a very huge difference or increase in the civilian casualties, especially by the Afghan air forces. I guess that the war or the fight has also increased as compared to the previous years, because since the Taliban started negotiation with the U.S. envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, and they reached an agreement in February 2020, even during their negotiation, the Taliban's negotiation with the U.S., they increased the attacks on the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And now that the intra-Afghan peace talks have started, Taliban are trying to gain something more on the table, on the peace negotiating table. And the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is also trying to show that they are governing overall Afghanistan and they have more land under control. So I guess the war has increased, or the fight has increased. Therefore, the civilian casualties have also increased. And one of the reasons why the civilian casualties have increased is that now the control of the Air Force is also with the Afghan security forces, with the Afghan Air Force. And I guess some problems or miscoordination or miscommunication in giving the coordinates, as well as the other problem is the Taliban are using the civilians' homes as shelters. So these 2 points make the civilian casualties more as compared to the previous years.
Jonathan, thoughts on that? Because, in the midst of this peace process, right, where, to the credit of everybody involved, at least we've gotten to this point, right, and there's this light at the end of the tunnel, seemingly. Civilian casualties can only ever be a bad thing, right, because it just creates animosity, doesn't it? And at the end of the day, we're meant to be prioritizing and, giving equal value to every life. So an Afghan life should also matter. But I mean, if this has sort of happened at such drastic numbers, 330% seems like a very huge jump, doesn't it?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. There are two sides of the story. And on the one hand, you have the Al Jazeera report, like you said, that talks about a 330% increase in civilian casualties in Afghanistan. But on the other hand, the other side of the story is the Pentagon report that says that U.S. coalition forces only killed 130 civilians in Afghanistan. And the reality is that most civilians in Afghanistan were killed by Kabul's forces, by the AAF, by the Afghanistan Air Force. And if you look at the details of the AAF, the Afghanistan Air Force uses old Soviet planes that cannot perform surgical strikes. See, a surgical strike is an Air Force strike that kills as few civilians as possible. And the planes used by the AAF are MiG-17s and MiG-21s that were built in the 1950s. And they inflict huge structural damage, which means that every time they strike, they just blow it up. So they kill as many civilians as possible. So we also have to look at the weapons they use. There are no surgical strikes. There are no clean targets. So that's the problem.
That's Hamdullah. What are your thoughts on that? Is this an issue of the Afghan forces not having the right equipment, not being able to carry out surgical strikes? What are your thoughts about that argument, about who then holds the responsibility here?
I guess we cannot blame only the AAA for Afghan Air Force in their airstrikes. You know that even now, sometimes when the airstrikes are needed in fighting against Taliban, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan still use the American forces or the international forces to have the airstrike or the air raid in some specific provinces where the war gets very violent. Then the international forces are still used. So we cannot say that these civilian casualties are all related just to the Afghan Air Force air raids. First of all, this cannot be directly related to them. International forces are also doing the airstrikes till the moment. And I guess killing the civilian by anyone, by Taliban, by the international forces, by Americans, by the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, it's not forgivable. No one should make such mistakes, and the people of Afghanistan will never forgive them. Whoever kills the Afghans, killing is killing, murdering is murdering. Whoever kills them, civilians are killed. And this, the demand of the people is to stop this. And they asked the Taliban and the Afghan government and the international forces or the international community to stop war in Afghanistan and to go for the ceasefire and continue or proceed with the intra-Afghan peace talks so that the bloodshed in Afghanistan will stop.
That's a good point, isn't it, Jonathan? I mean, I also want to, bring this up with you that, that do you think that we should just blindly, for example, believe a Pentagon report versus an Al Jazeera report? And I'm not saying either or is correct. I mean, sometimes, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But then, it's also a question of the fact that it's not like airstrikes just in Afghanistan would have killed civilians as collateral damage. This has happened in other places as well. We can possibly think of just collateral damage overall in a place like Iraq or possibly, elsewhere also, I'm sure, over the time of history that we can possibly talk about when we've spoken about collateral damage, quote unquote, the term. I mean, that in and of itself seems like a very impersonal term to use, doesn't it? Where it's just like we don't again value the human life at the end of that attack. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, and you're right, but if you look at the statistics by the Iraq Body Count Project, 200,000 civilians were killed in Iraq alone, mostly by local forces. Very few of them were killed by U.S. coalition forces. So we have 200,000 people being killed in Iraq and only 700 this year in Afghanistan. And yes, every human life counts, but again, is there a clean war? For sure, we need to have as many surgical strikes as possible where only terrorist targets are killed. I think it's possible if we have the right weapons, if we have the right mindset. So is it murder? See, murder is intentional. So if you intentionally kill civilians, yes, it's murder. But if it's collateral damage, unfortunately, that's the impact of war. And like you said, just U.S. coalition forces are bringing down strikes. In fact, they're even withdrawing troops. As the peace talks are going on, they're withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. President Trump has committed to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and he has done that.
Okay, so then what happens next? As in, what is the feeling of Afghans then towards their own government, towards the U.S. coalition? Because I'm sure that this sort of thing comes up in conversations, right, amongst the population?
Well, the Afghans, the nation is worried. Why the nation is worried? Because Afghan peace talks have started between the Taliban movement and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Both Taliban and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan are trying to increase the war, or at least to fight each other to make the opposite weaker. And here, the civilians are killed. Here, the areas or the country is insecure. So here, the people are worried. The people want to stop this war, to go for the ceasefire, to stop the bloodshed of the civilians, of the Taliban, of the military forces of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and of every Afghan. They call on the international community through the social media, through the mass media, and through some political parties, huge gatherings, even through some formal meetings with the High Council of Reconciliation, which is led by Dr. Hamdullah. People have raised their voice against the war in Afghanistan, and they're hoping for a long-term ceasefire during the peace negotiation between the Taliban and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Once there is a ceasefire, the civilian casualties will be reduced to zero, or they will at least go towards zero. And if they continue fighting against each other just to make sure they gain more on the peace negotiation or negotiating table, then I guess the bloodshed will continue. More Afghan civilians will be killed by both Taliban and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and as well as the international community who are doing the airstrikes in Afghanistan.
All right, there's a final word. The clock has gotten the best of us. We sincerely appreciate both Hamdullah and Jonathan for their time today. Jonathan, they're speaking to us from Orlando, and Hamdullah was speaking to us from Kabul, Afghanistan. Speaking about civilian casualties in Afghanistan, and the figure 330%, as Jonathan there said, there is another figure, of course, from the Pentagon, which says the number is significantly lower of civilians killed because of its coalition and its airstrikes. Of course, as I'd put to Jonathan as well, the truth is maybe somewhere in the middle. There's always been that discrepancy in numbers of civilians, but it's always been a very impersonal process, right, where we don't know even the names of the people at the end. We don't, again, value those human lives enough, and that's something which really needs to change, because the moment we don't value an Afghan life, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, then there's no way to really ensure that a peace process is successful. Once every life is valued, a civilian life that is valued, then we can move on to talk about issues of justice, accountability, proper governance, etc. But until that point, it's very hard to then be able to accept that peace will just magically appear and that all Afghans will simply just accept the situation as it is without any justice or accountability. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to end off our show by discussing anti-Sikh crimes, which are hate crimes, that is, which are taking place in the UK. According to Home Office figures themselves, over the last 2 years, these hate crimes against the Sikh community have increased by around 70%, which is a fairly drastic number if you actually think about that. And that's, of course, calling for prompting calls, that is, for urgent action on the part of even an MP in the British Parliament. The All-Parliamentary Group for British Sikhs has found the lack of an official term of definition for hate crimes against the Sikh community is also then hindering progress in that regard and in dealing with that and getting the right attention to the hate crimes that this community is facing there in the UK. Government figures have shown 117 hate crimes were recorded against Sikhs in the years between 2017 and 2018, and compared to 202 between 2019 and 2020 so far. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Dr. Eleanor Nesbitt, who is a Professor Emeritus of the University of Warwick. She's joining us today from Coventry in the UK. Eleanor, we really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us. How do you react to this? I mean, I know that obviously since 9/11, even in the US, for example, there was an issue where there was a lot of hate crimes against the Sikh community too, because as we know, a lot of hate comes from ignorance, right? So there wasn't even this understanding of the difference between a Muslim and a Sikh. Is that the same case, do you think, in the UK?
Absolutely. It's very definitely the same case, and it affects the way in which hate crimes are recorded, because the police report the perceived religion of the victim. So, for example, if anti-Islamic graffiti were daubed on a Hindu mandir, that would be recorded as Islamophobic because it's clearly directed against Islam, but mistakenly, in a sense, that the place of worship is not a Muslim place of worship. And that happens particularly to Sikh individuals, as well as sometimes Sikh monuments or buildings, because you rightly mentioned 9/11. And so in a swathe of the public imagination, there is an equation between all turban-wearing, Asian-looking males. And of course, Sikhs, Keshdhari, pug-wearing Sikhs, appear to fit, that description of an Islamist extremist.
So then what is the way to deal with this? Because I mean, I know that the Sikh community has been great about standing with, with the Muslim community through, acts of Islamophobia ever since 9/11, I'm saying, but even otherwise also. Do you think that there needs to be, as has been spoken of by the All-Parliamentary Group for British Sikhs, that there needs to be a definition, a term almost, that we need to agree upon to deal with just hate crimes against the Sikh community?
Well, I think it would be perhaps useful to have a term, but it's not going to make any difference to the fact of Sikhs and sometimes others being attacked because they're perceived to be Muslim. So there needs to be massive education, but the religious education needs to be much better informed as well, so that young people entering adult society have a much clearer idea, not just that Sikhs do this and Muslims wear that and so on, but actually of the freedom to religious belief and the importance of religion as a positive force in our society. And I think actually during this pandemic year, more and more people have seen the public face of Sikhism as Sikhs devotedly serving society through extending their langar to support those who are in need of food, going beyond the gurdwaras into society, so that increasingly people will identify the turbaned Sikh person with acts of public goodwill and service.
Yeah. How much of this, obviously you've already mentioned the pandemic, so, the pandemic has certainly brought out, unfortunately, also in the negative side, a lot of hate and prejudice in some ways in many, many countries. I imagine that may be the case there in the UK overall, I'm speaking, of course. Do you think that Brexit has also played a part in this? Because, there was a lot of talk about anti-immigrant rhetoric during that, and now we are still very much in the last stages of Brexit. Do you think all of that has also exacerbated hate crimes towards the Sikh community?
I mean, before I get into that, I think it does need to be made clear that 70% sounds very dramatic, but it's not quite as simple as that, partly because, for example, if you compare the 188 cases in 2018-2019 with the 202 reported so far in 2019-2020, it isn't as dramatic as a 70% increase, as it were, in the last year. And sometimes people have a knee-jerk reaction to figures. There's also the fact that if more people are reporting crimes and if the police themselves are recording more crimes that are reported, then there will appear to be an increase in the incidents when in fact there's an increase in the reporting and the recording. Having said all of that, there are spikes. There was a spike in assaults on Muslims and Sikhs after 9/11. There was a spike after a terrorist attack in the UK, I think in 2017. Yes, the referendum in 2016, that intensified the feeling that it was all right for Britain to be hostile and to pick on people who looked different. That wasn't specifically Sikhs, but anybody who looked different, no matter how long they'd lived in this country. And yes, events have an effect, but it's not straightforwardly that there's been an upward surge sort of ever since 9/11.
There I had, and maybe we have different figures, Eleanor, was 117 for 2017, 2018. Those might be obviously, I imagine that there are differences in figures in these sorts of things, as you said, according to the reporting as well. But nevertheless, as a final thought before I let you go, I wanted to ask you then, considering, there is this similarity almost in this wholesale just, staining, if I may even use that term, of minorities, and especially, I imagine, South Asians into one huge group because of 9/11 and any associated issues. Does that then mean that there is more unity amongst then that group of South Asians, or that there should be, of course, to be able to then fight any form of hate crime against any member of that community, be they Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, or otherwise?
Well, one hopes, and I'm sure that there are feelings of solidarity, and not only that, there's a feeling of solidarity that you would find, for example, in Christian groups or in Jewish groups with those of religious identity or persuasion who are being persecuted or targeted for that reason. To go back to the figures, yes, you're absolutely right. What I quoted was the 2018-19 But yes, that was a steep increase from previous 2017-2018 figure of 117. But as I said, the numbers, they're useful to an extent, and especially if they galvanize support and support across communities, but they do have to be deconstructed quite carefully. And, in Britain, we have organizations, multi-faith fora, interfaith network, interfaith groups in towns up and down the country, all working together across faith divides to tackle prejudice and crime in as positive a way as possible, and to increase the awareness of religion as an expression of compassion rather than a cause for fear.
Indeed. I believe there was a final word, but we sincerely appreciate Eleanor for her time and her expert insight today. That was Eleanor Nesbitt speaking to us there from Coventry in the UK, sharing her expert thoughts about this 70% figure. As she said, of course, it's very important to contextualize this, right? So we are from then 2018 to 2019 going from 188 to 202 from 2019 to 2020 now, till now at least. But nevertheless, I mean, it's still worrying, right? Hate crimes towards any group are always worrying and are always to be discouraged and are always to be a worrying factor. In this case, if it's the Sikh community, then of course other communities should also band together with the Sikh community to ensure that its members, its followers are protected and are not then, of course, the victim of any such hate crime, especially considering, of course, these communities, again, have not been in the UK just for a number of years. They've been there for generations. They've been contributing members of the society. So it's not like they're brand new and just have shown up on their shores. Even if they have, I mean, they shouldn't be subject to any hate crimes, but even these sorts of communities have been there for so long that it sort of defies logic now in the year 2020 to have hate crimes against them, especially considering they've been part and parcel of British society. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.